Out in the American Southwest, there's a stretch of highway that doesn't show up on most maps. The kind of place where even the wind sounds like it's telling stories. You don't find it on purpose. It finds you when the road knows you need a break. Along that road sits a diner, just a blink past nowhere. Betty's Diner. The paint's peeling, the sign flickers more than it glows, and the front step creaks like it's remembering every boot that's crossed it. But it's still standing, like some places do, out of pure stubbornness. Inside, it's as if time's been paused since 1973. Red vinyl booths with tears patched by duct tape. Coffee pots that look older than the waitress pouring from them. The jukebox hums but never sings, like it knows the music would be wasted. The kind of place where people don't talk much, not because they've got nothing to say, but because they've said it all before. At a corner booth, facing the window but not really looking out, sits a man. He wears a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to hint at stories written on the skin and scar. His cowboy hat rests on the table beside him, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. That man is Chucknorris. He doesn't speak. He doesn't fidget. He doesn't do anything, really, except exist in a way that feels permanent. The waitress Sally keeps an eye on him, not out of suspicion, but respect. Like when you see a storm cloud sitting still and wonder how long before it moves. The coffee in front of him has gone lukewarm. He doesn't seem to care. They say Chuck used to be a man people called when they were out of options. A last resort, a final card you didn't want to play unless the house was on fire. But today he's just a man at a booth, letting the world forget about him while he tries to forget something else. Outside, the wind swirls dust in lazy spirals. It's hot, the kind of heat that makes you question your existence. But inside, everything is still. A soft hum from the lights, the scrape of a fork on ceramic, the occasional cough from an old man in the back. Chuck lifts his cup finally and takes a small sip. There's no grimace. He's tasted worse. He's been worse. He sets it down just as gently as he picked it up. Maybe he came here because it was the last place he hadn't. Maybe he came because no one would expect to find him here. Or maybe, just maybe, he came because even legends need quiet sometimes. Everyone in the diner knows who he is, not because he told them, because legends don't have to speak their names. You feel it, in the way the air feels heavier around him, in the way your instinct tells you to mind your manners. Sally refills his cup, careful not to say too much. "You good, hun?" A simple nod. That's all she gets, all she needs. There's a sort of peace in the place, a fragile kind that settles in when everyone's quietly agreed to keep to themselves. But peace, like anything worth having, never lasts long. And that's when the first low growl of motorcycle engines rumbles through the air. There's an unspoken rule in life: never mess with a man whose beard has its own zip code. But the thing about rules is, the wrong kind of people love to break them. Chuck doesn't flinch, doesn't blink, just stares forward, slow and still. The kind of stillness that makes everything else seem too loud. He didn't come here for trouble, he came for quiet. And the universe? It was about to forget that rule. Peace is a fragile thing. It can be shattered not with a scream, but with a sound. In this case, it started with the low, hungry growl of a motorcycle engine. Then another, then 5 more. Like a pack of wolves, their approach wasn't fast. It was deliberate, meant to be heard, felt, and feared. Betty's diner trembled slightly as the roar grew closer, dust rising from the gravel lot as 7 black bikes came into view. Chrome teeth, leather jackets, and bad intentions. The kind of crew that didn't need to say they were trouble. Their entrance said it for them. The locals turned toward the windows. Forks paused mid-bite. Conversations cut short. Sally behind the counter pressed her lips into a thin line. She didn't need this today. No one did. The first bike skidded into a crooked park. The others followed, forming a jagged, noisy wall of rebellion. The riders dismounted, kicking their boots in unison. They weren't here for pie. They were here to be noticed. Rip Gutterson led the pack. 6.5 feet of muscle, leather, and beer-fueled arrogance. A walking, snarling symbol of chaos. His beard was a mess of braids and oil, his vest covered in patches no law-abiding biker gang would claim. His eyes scanned the diner like a predator scoping out a den of sheep. Behind him trailed his loyal band of misfits. Tank, who could lift a Harley with one arm and crush a beer can with the other. Knuckles, who hadn't said a word in 3 years, but communicated everything with a glare. Snake, slick and wiry, always chewing on something. Toothpick, gum, or bad intentions. And the rest, equally uninvited. The front door of the diner creaked open like it was groaning in protest. Rip was the first to enter, ducking just slightly under the wooden frame. His boots thudded against the tile with weight and purpose. The bell above the door gave a hesitant jingle, as if warning the room rather than greeting it. "Well, well," Rip sneered, scanning the patrons. "Smells like bacon and bad decisions in here." The laughter that followed wasn't light. It was a performance. Loud, jarring, and intentionally aggressive. The kind of laugh meant to poke, prod, and provoke. They moved in like a storm. Elbows bumped shoulders. A napkin dispenser clattered to the ground. The jukebox received a hard slap from Tank. Static crackled, then silence. Knuckles leaned over a booth and snatched a half-eaten pancake from a terrified trucker. And in the far corner, Chucknorris didn't move. Sally, trying to do her job with dignity, approached with her order pad. Her voice, steady but small, cut through the noise. "Can I help you fellas with something?" Rip turned slowly, leaning across the counter like it belonged to him. "Yeah," he drawled. "You can help us by keeping that coffee hot and those lips quiet." Behind him, laughter again. Snake made an exaggerated kissing noise. Tank barked something unintelligible. Sally gave a stiff nod and stepped back. Her eyes flicked toward Chuck. He hadn't spoken, hadn't blinked. Still that mountain of silence in the booth. One of the bikers, Bulldog, grabbed the sugar shaker and began pouring it straight into his mouth. Another jumped onto the counter and spun, knocking a pile of menus onto the floor. "This place is dead," Rip said loudly, looking around with mock disappointment. "Let's liven it up." Snake found the jukebox again and jabbed at it. After a few angry presses and a fist to the side, a heavy metal track sputtered to life. Loud, distorted guitars filled the air. And still, Chuck didn't move. Rip noticed. Of course he did. You don't dominate a room without clocking the one person who refuses to be dominated. He turned slowly, adjusting his vest. "Hey," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Who's the cowboy?" Tank squinted, following Rip's gaze. "Just some old dude. Looks like he came with the furniture." "Yeah? Well, he's in our booth now." The gang shifted focus. The tension thickened. Chairs scraped. People held their breath. Rip took a few slow steps toward Chuck, savoring the silence that followed in his wake. Each bootfall sounded like a countdown. He stopped at the edge of the booth and looked down. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, tapping the edge of the table with a ringed finger. "You deaf or just rude?" Chuck didn't respond. Didn't look up. Just reached for his coffee and took a sip. Rip grinned. "Guess he needs help understanding." With a quick flick, he slapped the mug from Chuck's hand. It shattered against the floor. The diner went completely still. No music, no laughter, just silence. To them, he was just a quiet guy in a booth. To reality, he was an extinction-level event. Time slowed. It had to. Reality needed a moment to process what just happened. Rip's hand had moved fast, careless, confident. Chuck's mug shattered on the floor, its contents splattered across faded tiles and worn leather boots. The smell of burnt coffee filled the air, but nobody breathed it in. Everyone in the diner froze. Not out of fear of Rip. They'd seen men like him before. No, this was different. It was the way Chuck didn't move right away. Like a volcano that hasn't erupted in years, but suddenly lets out a puff of smoke. The kind of quiet that hums with the weight of a coming storm. Chuck slowly placed both hands on the table, fingers steady. He looked up for the first time. Not quickly, not with surprise, with intent. His eyes met Rip's, and there was no anger in them. Just recognition, like he'd seen Rip before. Not this Rip, maybe, but 1,000 others just like him. Different names, same mistake. A hush fell over the room. Even the jukebox, caught between tracks, seemed to hesitate. The clatter of a fork dropping was the only sound, but it felt like thunder. And then Chuck spoke. "You just made a mistake." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it hit harder than any shout. Rip stepped back half an inch, caught off guard by the calm. His grin faltered. "What did you say, old man?" Chuck rose. He didn't stand like someone preparing for a fight. He stood like someone preparing to stretch, like he'd been sitting too long, and this nonsense was more an inconvenience than a threat. He stood slowly, deliberately, and somehow that was worse. He was taller than he looked sitting down, broader too. His flannel shirt hung loose, but now his sleeves rolled slightly higher, enough to reveal forearms carved from time, and a black belt tied with the kind of precision only a lifetime of repetition could produce. The belt was faded, nearly gray in places, not because it was worn out, but because it had witnessed things. It was not a symbol of status. It was a resume. Rip's crew chuckled nervously. Tank adjusted his stance. Snake gave a shrug like this wasn't his business. But even they weren't as sure anymore. Chuck looked at Rip again. "You were loud when you walked in. That usually means one of two things. You're scared or you're stupid. Which one is it?" Rip's face hardened. "You got a death wish, Grandpa?" Chuck didn't blink. "I've lived enough for 2 lifetimes. You think you can scare me with boots and bad breath?" A pause stretched between them. The tension was electric. Sally behind the counter didn't breathe. No one did. Rip lunged. Chuck moved like water. One hand caught Rip's wrist mid-swing. The room gasped. His grip tightened, a subtle motion, but Rip's face contorted. Chuck leaned in, his voice a whisper that somehow carried. "I don't start fights. I end them." Rip twisted, tried to pull away. Chuck turned his wrist and Rip dropped to one knee, grimacing. Chuck let him go. Rip staggered back, humiliated. "You think you're tough because you ride a loud bike and wear rings?" Chuck said, turning to the rest of the gang. "Tough isn't what you wear. It's what you walk away from." The bikers didn't laugh anymore. Even Tank had gone still. Chuck stepped forward, one step, then another. He walked past Rip, calm as ever, like a man walking through fog. He stopped just in front of the jukebox. "You call that music?" he said, almost to himself. Then he tapped a button. The machine clicked. The track changed. Johnny Cash. "That's better." He turned, walked back to his booth, and sat down. He picked up the second cup of coffee Sally had left earlier. It was cold now. He drank it anyway. A beat passed, then 2. Rip looked around, looked at his boys. His ego told him to try again. His instincts told him to leave. And for once in his life, Rip listened. It wasn't the words that scared them. It was the tone, like thunder before the storm. There's a moment between knowing you've made a mistake and suffering the consequences. A moment when your gut drops, your throat tightens, and your legs feel too heavy to run. For Rip Gutterson and his gang, that moment had arrived. Rip stepped back, humiliated but too proud to admit it. His hand still stung from Chuck's grip. He looked to Tank, then to Knuckles, waiting for one of them to reclaim the fear they'd come to spread. Tank made the first move. He stepped forward with all the grace of a wrecking ball, cracking his knuckles like gunshots in a church. He was massive, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, the kind of guy people avoided in parking lots. He gave a grin, or maybe it was a snarl, and lunged. "You want a show, old man?" Tank growled. Chuck stood. No drama, no haste, just a simple act of rising, as if the air around him knew to clear the way. Chuck looked at Tank, not up, not down, just at him. And that's what made it worse. There was no fear, no threat, just patience. The kind you only get when you've handled worse before lunch. Tank swung, a wild, heavy right hook, the kind that ends bar fights. Chuck stepped to the side, barely moved. Tank's punch cut through air and found only gravity. Before Tank could even reset, Chuck turned and tapped the back of his neck with the edge of his hand. Tank dropped like a sandbag. For a second, no one spoke. Then chaos erupted. Knuckles charged. Snake followed. Bulldog dove at Chuck from behind. But Chuck was already moving. He ducked under Knuckles' swing, grabbing his arm mid-motion and using his momentum to flip him headfirst into the counter. The sound of crashing salt shakers and groaning biker was followed by a thud as Snake tried to tackle him from the side. Chuck pivoted, dropped his weight, and rolled Snake across his back like a sack of onions, sending him flying over a table into a booth occupied by two astonished tourists. Bulldog came in snarling, swinging a chair. Chuck stepped forward and kicked. Not hard, not high, just precisely. The chair exploded into kindling as Bulldog fell back, tripping over Tank's unconscious legs. Razor rushed in with a pool cue. Chuck caught it, snapped it over his knee, and jabbed Razor gently in the chest with one half. Razor spun backward like he'd been hit by a truck. Buzz picked up a ketchup bottle and aimed it like a weapon. Chuck raised an eyebrow. Really? Buzz hesitated, then squeezed. Ketchup flew and missed. Chuck tilted his head. That was all. Buzz slipped on the mess, arms flailing, and landed squarely in the middle of a stack of plates. Shards flew, but Chuck was already gone, moving like a whisper. The fight, if you could call it that, lasted less than a minute. One by one, the bikers fell. Not just down, but out. Dazed, bruised, wounded in places you couldn't bandage. Sally ducked behind the counter. One of the cooks poked their head out of the kitchen and immediately went back inside. A man filming on his phone quietly mouthed the words, "Oh my God." Chuck turned to the last two, Razor and Buzz. They looked at each other, looked at Chuck, then turned and ran for the door. But they didn't make it. Chuck didn't chase. He didn't need to. He reached behind him, picked up the only thing not yet broken, a full glass of water, and flicked it at their feet. They slipped. Landed face first, both groaned. Chuck walked over calmly and helped them up, just enough to dust them off and guide them gently into each other's heads. They went down again. He straightened his shirt. The jukebox, having recovered from earlier abuse, switched tracks. 80s hair metal. Chuck gave a small nod. Acceptable. Sally peeked over the counter. Is it over? Chuck glanced around. 7 bikers, 1 conscious. Maybe. Yeah, he said. They'll stay down. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even the air seemed to hesitate, unsure if it should move without Chuck's permission. A man in the back clapped. Once, then twice. And soon the entire diner broke into stunned applause. Chuck didn't bow, didn't smile. He just sat back down at his booth, as if none of it had happened. He reached for the second cup of coffee Sally had left earlier. It was cold now. He drank it anyway. Chuck didn't hit back. He hit first, second, and third in under a second. The dust hadn't settled yet. Not fully. The air still held the echoes of chaos, of boots hitting tile, of chairs splintering and bikers groaning. But slowly the quiet returned to Betty's diner, like a dog slinking back after a storm. People blinked, breathed, realized they'd survived something legendary. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. One by one, the bikers began to stir, groaning, muttering, holding ribs, heads, and pride. Rip Gutterson was the first to rise, limping slightly, his vest torn, one boot missing. His expression wasn't rage, it was confusion, like the laws of the universe had just been rewritten. He looked at his men, sprawled out like fallen dominoes. Tank tried to sit up, then laid back down with a grunt. Bulldog whimpered something about needing ice. Razor sat cross-legged in the gravel, chewing on the stub of his broken pool cue like it might make sense of what happened. Buzz crawled to his bike, ketchup smeared across his vest like a scarlet letter. Snake, lying nearby, muttered, "We picked the wrong diner, man. The wrong damn diner." And standing in the middle of it all, untouched, unbothered, was Chucknorris. He stepped outside, not with swagger, but with the calm of a man who didn't need to prove anything. He surveyed the aftermath like a carpenter checking the level on a finished beam. Rip looked up, trembling slightly. What are you?" Chuck bent down and picked up Rip's helmet, dusting it off like a gift from a forgotten time. He handed it to Rip with quiet authority. "Safety first." Rip took it with both hands as if accepting a sacred object. He didn't speak. Couldn't. Inside the diner, the applause had stopped. Not out of disinterest, but because everyone had run out of breath. Sally leaned against the counter, one hand over her heart. He just handed it to him, she whispered, like a parent handing a kid his lunchbox. Chuck returned to his booth like a man who'd just taken a short walk, not fought off 7 bikers with less effort than it takes to open a jar. The place felt different now, not just relieved, reverent. The kind of reverence usually reserved for war memorials and sacred sites. No one could explain what had happened, but everyone understood. Chuck sat down, lifted his coffee cup again. It was still cold. Still didn't matter. He sipped it with the same expression he'd had when he arrived. Rip and the others, battered and broken, slowly mounted their bikes. Engines coughed, metal groaned, and like ghosts returning to the highway, they rode away. Not fast, not loud, just away. The last to leave was Rip. He glanced back once, eyes meeting Chuck's through the glass. Chuck didn't wave, didn't nod, but Rip flinched anyway. Inside, the silence cracked again. Laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes not from amusement, but from relief. A trucker called out, "Remind me never to complain about cold coffee again." Someone else raised their mug and toasted, "To Chuck." The tension began to break, like sunlight peeking through storm clouds. Conversations picked up cautiously at first, then more freely. The diner felt like a place you'd actually want to be again, not just for the food, but for the story people would tell for years. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, was that a cowboy or a superhero?" She smiled. "Both, honey, both." Sally approached Chuck's booth again, still cautious. "Refill?" Chuck shook his head. "Just the check." She placed it gently on the table. "You know," she said softly, "I've worked here 23 years. I've seen a lot of weird stuff. But that," he didn't look up. "Just a coffee break." She smiled. "Well, you're welcome back anytime." Chuck nodded, folded a $100 bill around the check, stood, tipped his hat, and walked out into the setting sun. He left behind no business card, no signature, no trace, except the story. Inside, customers leaned toward each other, already retelling it. That was Chucknorris. Inside, the customers erupt into applause. Waitress Sally watches Chuck walk back to his seat. That was Chucknorris. As Chuck walked away from Betty's diner, the last golden rays of sunlight spilled across the parking lot, catching the edges of the dust like glitter. The clink of the door's bell echoed one last time behind him. He didn't look back. He never did. Each step felt measured, grounded, not rushed, not slow, purposeful. The kind of walk that carried both history and warning. He crossed the gravel lot with the same silence that had carried him through the chaos. The wind picked up, blowing in from the east like it too was following his lead. The moment his boots touched the asphalt of the open road, the mood shifted. Not for him, but for the universe. Across the street, parked under the long shadow of a billboard advertising beef jerky and discount oil changes, sat a vehicle that hadn't been there minutes ago. It was a black SUV, tinted windows, no plates, government-issued or worse, corporate. Inside, a figure sat motionless. Black suit, black tie, earpiece. His expression unreadable behind a pair of mirrored sunglasses. He didn't reach for the coffee sitting in the console cup holder. He didn't touch the radio. He just watched. Chuck paused. He didn't need to turn his head to know he was being observed. Legends didn't need eyes in the back of their heads. They had instincts carved into the bone. The figure lifted a radio. "This is Shadow Base. Target has resurfaced. I repeat, the ghost has returned." The voice was flat, all protocol, but there was a tremor buried deep in the tone. A tremor only fear could cause. "Do not engage," the voice on the other end crackled. "Repeat, do not engage. Track only. Maintain distance." Inside the diner, the mood had shifted from stunned silence to animated storytelling. Patrons were already embellishing their versions of events. Some swore Chuck had disarmed a biker mid-punch. Others claimed he levitated. Sally smiled behind the counter, shaking her head at the exaggerations but letting them flow. But out there, in the real world, someone was taking Chuck's reappearance very seriously. Back near the alley, a second figure appeared. Smaller, faster, another suit. This one with a tactical edge. He stepped out of the shadows and moved toward Chuck. Chuck stopped. Didn't speak, didn't posture, just turned his head. A slow, precise motion. The second man froze. He was younger, maybe eager. But that look in Chuck's eyes, it said, "You have a choice right now. Make the wrong one, and we'll both know it was your last." The suit backed off. Slowly, hands up, message received. The SUV engine rumbled to life. It didn't peel out. It drifted away, like a predator retreating. Not because it lost interest, but because it needed a better plan. Inside the vehicle, the agent finally removed his sunglasses and sighed. The world thought he disappeared. His partner, keeping one eye on the rearview mirror, said nothing for a moment. Then, turns out, he was just waiting. Chuck, meanwhile, just kept walking, boots tapping the shoulder of the highway, coat billowing slightly. A man alone, but never truly alone. Because wherever he went, the story followed. And now, so did the attention. He didn't walk like someone looking over his shoulder. He walked like someone who knew what was behind him and didn't care. He passed a mile marker. A bird circled overhead. The wind picked up. Somewhere far away, another phone began to ring. Another briefing was being written. Another red folder with Chuck's name on it was slid across a table. In a dark conference room half a world away, someone circled a date on a wall calendar in red ink. He wasn't back. He'd never left. The world had simply forgotten what he was. But now it remembered, and it wasn't ready. At a remote desert airfield, a group of agents were already mobilizing. Names appeared on screens. Files surfaced that hadn't been opened in over a decade. A technician whispered, "He's on the grid again. That can't be a coincidence." "No," the commander replied. "It's not." Chuck stopped briefly at a roadside fence post, rested his hand on it. Not for support, for memory. He stared into the horizon. No words, just a presence that the land seemed to respect. The world thought Chuck had disappeared. Turns out, he was just waiting.